Okay, good morning, everyone. We are continuing our study in the book of Job. Today, we are going to address the concept of grief. Grief is a really big concept in the book of Job because, very simply, he's grieving, right? And I feel like grief is an important topic in the book of Job because everything Job says is in the midst of grief, and because of Job's friends who are not the best at helping someone through grief, right? Job's friends do a very, very poor job of assisting their friend who's going through a crisis right now. So to begin with, we are going to read of Job's tragedy. We're going to read a little bit from chapter 1. Chapter 1, verses 13 to 22. This is the reason why Job grieves. It says, "Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, 'The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, 'Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong." So, this morning talking about grief. The experience of grief is universal, right? It's felt by every person through the course of life. Because death is so common, grief is just as common. Since grief is so common, and since it has concerned people for centuries and millennia, you would think that grief would be a well-understood experience, and yet it isn't. Death and grief are just simply difficult issues to face, and when they come, we cope as best we can, but otherwise we prefer really not to talk about it. Right? This one quote says, "When death separates us from someone we love, there is a time when we think no one has suffered as we have." We have moments kind of like Job, even though plenty of people know exactly what we're going through. We feel like we alone stand, that no one understands what you're going through. In 1917, you had Sigmund Freud, who published this detailed psychological study on grief. And it was really the first of its kind. And years later, you had Eric Lindemann, a Harvard professor who wrote a highly acclaimed paper based on interviews with grieving relatives. And then soon you had books and articles start to appear about the study of grief. And probably the most famous is On Death and Dying, written by a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she was the person who came up with the 5 stages of grief. And probably more than any other publication, it's that book who really inspired the development of a whole new body of literature, a field that we call thanatology, the study of death and bereavement. Grief, to define it, is a normal response to the loss of any significant person, object, or opportunity. It is an experience of deprivation and anxiety that can show itself in one's behavior, emotions, thinking, physiology, interpersonal relationships, and spirituality. Grief is not limited to the loss of a loved one, right? Any kind of loss can lead to grief whenever it's very close to you. I mean, people have gone through the grief stages from a divorce, retirement from a job, amputation of a limb, departure of a child to university, moving from a friendly neighborhood, losing a home, losing the death of even a pet, right? Losing a sport, right? Health failures, the loss of someone's youthful appearance. That one's actually common. Loss of someone's confidence, loss of someone's enthusiasm, right? All of these things can bring about the process of grief. It produces a lot of time doubts about one's faith, right? This disillusionment of religious leaders. It produces this grief, this sadness, this emptiness. And really, it's just whenever a part of your life is lost or taken away, there is often grief. And even though grief can have a variety of causes, most often it's associated with the loss of a loved one, right? And that kind of grieving is never easy. We may try to soften the trauma by having our funeral where we tend to dress up the deceased, surround them with flowers, soft lights. We try to avoid the words such as died or death, saying passed away, departed. But no matter how much we try, it doesn't remove the full pain, does it? You see, as Christians, we take comfort and a peace that comes from God in the certainty of resurrection. Now, it doesn't remove the emptiness and the pain of losing a loved one, but there is a significant change in how we grieve because of God's truths. Right? God tells us, 1 Corinthians 15:54, when the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. And while that is absolutely 100% true, and we should praise God for it, it doesn't change that death still hurts. When we come to the Bible, there are so many different examples of death in people who are grieving. What are some examples that we can think of people who grieved? Crying. What's that? Crying? Oh, weeping, yeah.
Well, you can get angry still, too, but that's part of the grieving process.
Mm-hmm.
You can get angry. Blaming yourself, and sometimes people blame God.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Can we think of any individuals in the Bible who went through the grieving process, who grieved? Mary. Yeah, she lost her son. I mean. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jesus when he lost John the Baptist. Larry?
They were grieving over Lazarus.
Lazarus. That's a big one, isn't it? Kim?
David when the baby.
Mm-hmm. David, who lost his newborn child. Yeah, that's a really big one, isn't it? I mean, Carrie? Ruth and Naomi. Mm-hmm.
But then God grieved over all the sin.
Mm-hmm. God grieved over sin. Yeah, I mean, in the Bible, death is just a very common topic, and you see the reality of that in so many stories of people who have lost loved ones, right? In the Old Testament, I mean, these are the ones I thought of and that I wrote, right? You have Jacob mourning over the loss of Joseph, refusing to be comforted. I thought of David and his infant son. You have David and his grown sons, Amnon and Absalom. You have Jeremiah mourning the death of King Josiah. David when he mourned about his friend Jonathan, right?
What about Adam and Eve?
Adam and Eve? Yeah, they mourned you could say they had a grief process over just leaving the garden, but they lost a son as well, right? And so, the Psalms remind us of God's presence and comfort that as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? As we walk through a world where death is ever present. We learn that God's word encourages those who weep with grief. Isaiah portrays Jesus as a man of sorrows, acquainted with bitterest grief, right? And when we come to the New Testament really transforms our ideas of death and grieving. It genuinely does. In the New Testament, I think two really big points, right? And both have to do with Jesus. So you have first, Christ has really changed the meaning of grieving, right? In the sense of, some people who have no belief in the afterlife, when someone passes, that's just the end. And I think there is a greater sense of grieving that goes on. I think Christians who understand that Jesus is Lord, that He is the way, the truth, and the life, that there is a resurrection to come, that changes how you grieve. Genuinely, doesn't it? Death becomes less of a goodbye and more of a see you later, right? Death becomes more of a separation for a time rather than just being gone altogether, right? And when we look at the Christian perspective, I got two passages that I'll read. They're both very similar, right? It's 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. These are wonderful passages on the resurrection. So 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul starts off, he says, "For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep," that is, those who have died. And it's interesting how the New Testament, Jesus and Paul here calls death sleep. Now, why does he call death sleep?
Aren't you sleeping and then when you're risen to go wherever you're going to go?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Anyone want to add on to that? Sleep's not permanent. Yeah, just like you're risen when you don't want to go. Where are you going to go? Right. And so death, just the very idea of death gives the idea of permanence, doesn't it? That it is an end that is permanent.
Well, you said it's the end, but it's really at the beginning of where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I hope you're going to be.
Right. And I think that's why Jesus calls it sleep, right? Sleep is temporary, right? And so when Jesus and the apostles called death sleep, they're saying it's temporary, right? And so here it says God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep. God will bring with Him those who have passed, right? He says, "For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep." He says, "For the Lord Himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words." And so, in this context, Paul is really focusing on saying, those who have passed away, they're still going to get to go to heaven, right? He says, Paul is kind of trying to establish, before we go to heaven, there's going to be a resurrection. That those who have passed are going to come with us. We're not going to precede those who have passed. So he's saying those who have passed are all going to be resurrected, and then we're going to go with the Lord. And so the idea of the resurrection is that we're going to be reunited. And that idea itself of just saying that we're going to be reunited softens the pain of grieving, doesn't it? It doesn't eliminate it, but it softens it. 1 Corinthians 15. Very similar passage. He says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep," right? "But we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed." Again, he says the dead shall be raised. And here he's kind of focusing a little bit more on the idea that once they are raised and before we go to heaven, there's going to be a change in our kind of body, right? Whatever that may be. But the dead will be raised and we'll be with those who have been raised, and we're going to have this change as we go to heaven. He says, for this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. He says, O death, where is your sting? O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. He says, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And so in this passage, he likes to focus on the idea that what you're doing right here, right now as Christians is not in vain. That the work that you're doing will be rewarded. That when you pass, you will be resurrected. Or if you are living when the Lord returns, that you will be taken to heaven and changed with those who have passed away. And so he hits that point real hard. He says, death is swallowed up in victory. Death is defeated, right? He doesn't just say death is dead. He said death is swallowed up in victory to try to get the idea that death is going to be no more, and death is going to be replaced with victory, right? And so this knowledge is very comforting. It doesn't eliminate the pain of grief, right? But it softens it in the sense, and it gives us. It honestly takes what is so painful and makes it more motivating in saying that, as those who have passed away, we have this motivation to see them again. It is a motivation to be faithful to the Lord, to want to see the people who have passed away so that we can join them in heaven, right? And so, and there has been some unique scientific studies and evidence that people with religious beliefs are better able to cope with terminal illness, with the initial pain of death, to help people deal with their losses, to facilitate the grieving process. Studies show that when a grieving person has no religious beliefs, the pain hits them harder. And as a result, the pain is greater, the grieving is more difficult, and there's a greater potential for complicated grief. The second point, Christ has demonstrated the importance of grieving. Jesus himself was no stranger to grieving, right? He said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And you might say, well, that's in a spiritual way. Yes, but I think that also applies physically. And you see that in Jesus' life. You have Lazarus that was mentioned. When Lazarus died, Jesus was deeply moved, right? He accepted without comment the anger of Mary, Lazarus' sister, against Jesus, and that he wept with them, right? Even though he knew Lazarus was about to be raised from the dead. It says, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. Jesus wept in such a way that everyone knew that Jesus loved Lazarus. There's no question. You also have Jesus, whenever John the Baptist had been executed, he withdrew by himself, and this might have been to grieve. It says, and his disciples came and took the body of John the Baptist and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. So Jesus decided he would go to a desolate place. He wanted some alone time after John the Baptist had died. I would imagine part of that is grief, considering his cousin had just died, right? You have in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus admits his heavy sorrow, which I think today we would label it as an anticipatory grief. He said to the disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." I mean, that's Jesus himself admitting that he's basically grieving for what's about to happen. And so grief is absolutely 100% natural. It is healthy. It can be unhealthy, don't get me wrong, but grief is a good thing. It is a process by which we must undergo to adjust to a new set of reality, isn't it? You know, for 5 months after the attack on the World Trade Center in New York, there was this group who met with 2 counselors. And the group was unique in that they came from all different ethnic backgrounds. They had different levels of education, different ages, different stages in their life. Some of them were survivors. Others were family members of victims. Some were rescue workers. They had very little in common except for the fact that they were grieving. And that pulled them together. There was no set agenda for their meetings. Their conversation were often wide-ranging. Near the beginning, they discussed their utter incomprehensibility of what had happened. At different times, they shared their pain, their longing, their emptiness, their experiences on that faithful days, and their concerns about whether life would ever be normal again. At different times, they all wondered if their grieving was normal. They struggled to resume their activities, such as going to work or preparing for Christmas. One lady said, "When I walk down the street, I feel people know what has happened to me. They know because of the vacant look in my eyes." You know, what are some of the difficult tasks someone in grief has to go through? When you experience moments like these, what are some of the things you have to do to move forward? What are some of the steps of the grieving process, I should say?
Well, you can pray to God.
You have to pray to God.
To be able to not let it overwhelm your life.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard.
Yes, it is. Pray to God to make sure it doesn't overwhelm your life. Yeah, Rob? Accept that it's reality. And that's a really difficult thing. I mean, that's really ultimately kind of what you're trying to do. I guess that's kind of the ultimate goal, right? But it's not always easy, is it?
Nope.
Yeah, Kim? Go ahead.
You have to continue the day-to-day tasks that have to be done.
Mm-hmm. Continue the day-to-day tasks that have to be done. Yeah.
Well, it's like when we lost our 2 clients.
Mm-hmm.
They were with dementia and cancer so bad that I had to accept the fact that they weren't here, but they were whole again and they weren't hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sure does.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Shirley.
I have a friend who, they are Lutheran. Nothing wrong with that, I'm just saying, that's who they are. And very strong, always there, always doing,
Mm-hmm.
very active. She lost her mother. And I hadn't paid any attention because I'm busy on Sunday morning getting ready to do my thing.
Right.
And she said to me just not very long ago, I guess I'm going to get back to going to services. And I wanted to go, huh? But I didn't. She continued to say, and this shocked me, I had to take 2 months off from going to service, to church, to worship, do all this, just to get my head straight.
Right.
And I'm thinking, the first thing I did was get back here. And that helped me. I threw myself into doing things
Interesting.
because I had, nothing else to do.
Right.
And so I was able to go ahead and do things. It's just the way, I just don't think that's the way to handle it, but
Right.
that's the way she chose.
Right, right,
So I don't know if it worked for her or not.
right.
It wouldn't have worked for me, I know that.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, I think everyone grieves in very different ways. Personally, I wouldn't recommend that someone takes a break from church, but at the same time, like for instance, John Botker just passed. I talked to Wanda last night, and I actually called her last night, and I said, hey, this is the topic of Sunday morning Bible class. If you're not ready for it, I just wanted to let you know. And she said that she'll be here for worship today. And I was like, oh, okay, because I didn't know whether she was going to come to worship, because I totally understand missing a Sunday or two. I wouldn't recommend missing 2 months worth of worship, but at the same time, everyone grieves in a different way, and that's one of the complicated things about grief, right? These are the things that in my studying what I have found, I have a really, really awesome book that I love to refer to. It's called Christian Counseling, a Comprehensive Guide. And it's a book about this thick. So I love referring to it. And this book mentioned these things. Most grieving people face these kind of tasks. Accepting the loss that has taken place is real and permanent, right? Rob mentioned that. We got to accept it's real. Experiencing and expressing the emotions and the deep thoughts that are associated with loss. If you don't, sometimes grieving is like a roller coaster, and if you don't get on that roller coaster, it starts to get worse and worse and worse. You're going to have to get on the roller coaster at some point, but if you delay it, sometimes it gets worse, and that's kind of just how experiencing things goes. If you try to avoid experiencing it, sometimes it just blows up in your face. But you have to go through the motions, in a sense. You got to recall the warm memories, express the sadness, the loneliness, sometimes the anger. You got to untangle oneself from ties that bind the person to the deceased or whatever's been lost. And that's a painful process, very painful process. But it's that process of letting go, saying goodbye, slowly adjusting to life without the deceased. Doesn't mean that the deceased is forgotten by any sense, but it's reevaluating your life without them. And then there is moving forward, the reinvesting your energy into forming new relationships, pursuing new projects, setting new goals, cultivating fresh dreams or aspirations. It is that next step of life without them, Nobody can say how long the mourning process lasts. It depends upon the person. Sometimes it takes a few weeks, a few months, but whenever it's like the death of a spouse, some suggest that 3 to 4 years is typical. The loss, and more so whenever you're closer to them, of course. If you just lose a friend that you never really talked to, right? People who lose a child, usually that is one of the harder types of grief. But if we're trying to understand Job, right, and that's kind of who we're talking about, Job wasn't just undergoing grief, he was kind of undergoing a crisis, because not only did he lose all of his wealth, not only did he lose one child, he lost 10 children in one day. And child loss is considered the most severe form of grief. Across all grief studies, the death of a child produces the longest lasting grief symptoms, the deepest emotional impact, and the highest rate of complicated grief. Complicated grief is kind of the technical term for unhealthy grief, right? Parents often feel angry, guilty, depressed, self-condemning, incompetent. They feel like they failed to protect their child from death, even though there's probably nothing they could have done. There's this sense of injustice because we don't ever expect the children to die before the parents. For many couples, a child's death weakens a marriage, right? It destroys marriages. If the marriage had stress for any other reasons, the loss of a child might be that final straw that just eliminates the marriage. And this isn't, and there are occasions where a child's death brings a couple closer together, and I think that's good. But when we consider Job, I was looking, of course we know in Job chapter 2 how when Job's wife said to Job, do you still worship God, curse God, and die? Right? The pain of losing all their children caused tension and conflict in Job's marriage, didn't it? That Job's wife would turn on God, and when Job did not turn on God, Job's wife turned on him. Now, the marriage didn't end. I didn't find anything in the book of Job that said the marriage ended, right? At the end of the book of Job, Job ends up having more children, and it doesn't really mention the wife at the end. So in those days, the wife couldn't just divorce the husband because the wife didn't like it. So unless, Job's a pretty righteous guy, so I wouldn't think that Job would just divorce his wife because he's mad at her, right? So I don't think Job's marriage ended in the book, but, if it had ended, it'd be pretty understandable, wouldn't it? Not saying that'd be right, but losing all of your children in one go. But regardless, it caused tension in their marriage. So some writers and counselors have tried to identify specific stages of grieving. Now, today, a lot of people know the 5 stages of grieving, but professional counselors know that there is no specific stages of grieving, right? There is no orderly succession. There is no linear path. A lot of the times it's cyclical. A lot of the times you don't hit all 5 of these, right? But these are a good set of 5. Grief usually includes sorrow, pain, loneliness, anger, depression, often physical symptoms, changes in interpersonal relationships. A lot of times there's denial, fantasy, restlessness, disorganization, irritability, a desire to talk considerably about the deceased. Sometimes there's this unconscious adoption of the lost person's mannerism. And of course, the feeling that life has no meaning. And of course, Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying laid out these 5. You have denial. And denial is not always saying it doesn't happen. Sometimes denial is a dissociation from reality in the sense of you're in shock. There's that numbness, this disbelief, right? Then there's anger, that frustration, that resentment at your situation, yourself, others, or even God. You have bargaining, that kind of, if only I had done this, if only I had done this. Well, if I had done this, it wouldn't have happened. And sometimes it's that feeling of negotiation, right? Where you're trying, for the religious, they're trying to negotiate with God. For those who aren't religious, they're kind of trying to negotiate with fate. There's that feeling of depression, of course, and a lot of times it comes out with that deep sadness, the heaviness, the withdrawal. And then ultimately there's acceptance, acknowledging the reality of the loss and beginning to adapt to it. So when you experience grief, or when you see someone experiencing grief, know that these 5, not all of these 5 are going to be hit, and it's not going to be in that linear fashion, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like when we look at Job, for instance, he moves back and forth between depression, worshiping God, silence, worship, despair, hope, right? He's just a roller coaster, right? There is no linear path Job goes on. He doesn't hit all these 5 in the successive order, but I think he does hit all of these 5, right? He hits denial in the sense of he's in this state of shock and numbness, right? At first, when it happens, it says in chapter 2, verse 13, they sat with him on the ground, his friends, for 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. That state where you're such in shock, you're not interacting with the world at all. That's kind of your mind's way of shutting down. That's a sense of denial, right? In Job chapter 3, he talks about he wishes he was dead. And in a way, that is a form of denial, right? That's his way of saying, I reject this reality, I would rather be dead, right? That's kind of a form of denial in a sense. He says, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. You have anger. Anger is one of the most prominent emotions in the book of Job, right? He says, therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Those sound like anger to me, right? You have him say, he says to God, why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? That's what he said to God. He was angry, right? And you see bargaining. Bargaining is probably the most prominent thing Job is doing, but he's not bargaining in the sense of saying, God, I'll do this and you give me this, right? He's bargaining in the sense of he's asking for answers. He's looking for meaning, right? He's looking for a way to kind of undo or ease his suffering. And that would fall under the sense of bargaining, right? He says to God, if I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Yet he's asking questions. He's like, give me answers, right? He says, I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me, right? And of course, you see him go through classic, I guess I missed a slide. He goes through classic grief. He says, why is light given to him who is in misery and life to the bitter in soul? He says, I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are a breath. And interestingly enough, Job does go through acceptance. But like I said, grief is not a linear path, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because when the tragedy initially happens, he actually is in acceptance. Like right after it happens, this is what he said. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Right? If acceptance was the last stage of grief, well then that would be the end of it. But like I said, grief is not a nice, simple path. It's a roller coaster in which you go back and forth. And so Job, at the beginning, he's very accepting. And I think that's just because that's his initial reaction to any type of crisis. It shows kind of who he is as a person. But then, after the shock has set in, he goes on to that whole anger, depression, bargaining kind of sense, right? And there are moments in the middle of the book where he seems to have moments where he has hope in God and he worships God, and it sounds like he's starting to come around to acceptance, but then goes back. But it's not until really the end of the book, whenever he experiences God and talks to God, where he just kind of accepts it. He says, I know that you can do all things to God, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Right? You know, let me make a comment about Job's grief just for a second. There is such a thing as grief without death. We kind of touched on that. You know, Job's grief was, his children were a really big part of it, but don't minimize the loss of his business and his wealth, right? You know, like there are young athletes who work their entire life, who work every single day really hard to pursue an athletic achievement, and then they get an injury, and then they've just basically lost everything that they've been working through, and they go through the grieving process. You know, when someone puts their entire life into a business, and then they lose the business, they very well can go through the grieving process. And you consider Job, who has built his wealth up, and that took hard work, that took consistent discipline, that took day after day, hour after hour hard work, right? And then he lost it all. Don't minimize that and say, no, we're just focused on his kids. Also, I'm not going to say, let me say this. In the ancient world, death of children, I believe, hit them not as hard as it does us today. Okay, I'm not saying it was easy. You know, in the first century, in the days of Jesus, you know what percentage chance you had of reaching the age of 18? Can anyone guess? 50%. You had 50% chance of reaching the age of 18. You were likely to die within the first 5 years, but you were still likely to die in those first 18 years, right? And so when 50% of your children pass, it becomes much more normalized. And today, praise God that we have great medicine, we are sensitized to death, right? Whereas death was much more common back then. And so the death of his children still would have hit him very hard, but it wouldn't have hit us as, it's not a one-to-one comparison. You see what I'm saying here, that the grieving he had may have been very different. And also, add to that, part of the grieving he had was the fact that he could not have an heir. All of his sons had died, and he didn't have any daughters, if I recall correctly, until the very end. And then that means if you don't have a son, they can't have a son, and your lineage is ended. And in the ancient world, that is a sign of humiliation, right? And so that's part of his grieving process. And I say all that just to try to get us to understand that if Job had occurred today, the grieving would have looked a little differently. Now, he'd still be grieving, no question. Just making some small notes that in those days, the wealth would have hit him harder, and the children would have hit him maybe just a little bit lighter, I think. And I'm kind of speculating here. Maybe Job was the kind to be very different from the rest of the world, and that the fact that he was a godly man, and he put a lot more stock into his children. I'm just notes, just so you know. The effects of grieving, I don't think we're going to be able to get through all this, but that's okay. So, when you go through grieving, there are physical effects. If we had seen Job today and we saw all the ailments he was going through, we would have said that his ailments are manifestations of his grief. When you go through the grieving process, a lot of the times it shows physically, right? You become sick. Sometimes your immune system goes down and you're more susceptible to something. We know spiritually speaking, because the book reveals it to us, that was Satan. Now, perhaps, I always consider the fact that when God works through the world, that a lot of times he does it through natural means, right? And so perhaps Satan caused Job's affliction by making his grief manifest physical ailments, or maybe it was supernatural, who knows. But the point I'm trying to make is when you grieve, there are physical effects. And when you look at Job's life, look at the physical effects he had, right? Scripture tells us that he had loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the top of the crown of his head. He took a piece of broken pottery and he scraped himself. That means the sores were itchy, right? That were painful, right? And so he was scraping them because they were constantly so itchy. And it's hard to figure out in the book of Job how much is poetic language and how much is a real description of his ailments. But this is the kind of stuff he says. He describes that he looks different. His friends didn't recognize him from a distance. He loses his appetite. He has fears and depressions. He has these sores where he talks about how he has sores that his skin has hardened, but it opens and it blisters and it oozes with pus. I mean, these sound painful. He says he has worms in his sores, which could be one of two things, right? He says, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens, then breaks out afresh. This could be a real dermatological disease in the Near East, where what would happen is, as you would sleep or if you weren't paying attention, sandflies would get into your wounds and lay their eggs, right? Pretty gross stuff. Or this could be a medical thing where in those days they would put maggots on your wounds to clean them. And actually, that's a real thing. They eat the dead flesh, and it's actually a good thing, believe it or not. I would rather take some antibiotics, personally. He talks about difficulty in breathing, darkened eyelids. He talks about foul breath. He talks about losing weight, how the skin clings to his bones. He talks about excruciating, continual pain. One statement in 30:30, he says, my skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. This sounds like some sort of illness, maybe a high fever with chills, discoloring of the skin, right? I mean, it's just, I don't think he would give all these poetic languages if he wasn't actually very, very ill. So on top of when you imagine Job arguing with his friends, imagine someone who looks like they're on the edge, right? Imagine someone who just looks like they're on their deathbed. Because that's what we're talking about. Someone who is just as weak as can be and frail. I mean, personally, I can't imagine arguing with someone in that kind of state. But his friends argued with him, right? And you just continue talking about the effects of grieving. Obviously, there are going to be emotional and cognitive effects. We've kind of been talking about those. There's the social disruption. One note is that, he was sitting in the ashes. The ashes was an actual place. There would be a place in town. It would be the equivalent of our city dump, where you take the things that you want to get rid of and you would burn them. And it was a place that only the most isolated and the most rejected of the community went to. So when he's sitting in the ashes, it is a sign that the city has kind of rejected him. That, in this day and age, if all that happens to you, everyone thinks you're cursed by God, and they don't want anything to do with you, right? And so that's probably what's going on. And so there's this social disruption that it's not because of his grieving, but it's just kind of how everyone responds to him. But in the real world, when you grieve, a lot of the times there's a fundamental change in your relationships, right? A lot of the times isolation comes about. A lot of the times you separate from your friends, and that might be part of what Job is doing by sitting in the ashes, or it might be the community rejecting him, right? You have the spiritual responses. Grief has a way of either bringing you closer to God or farther apart. Job, of course, he goes through both. At first he's has a negative spiritual response where he's angry with God, and then he grows closer to God as he accepts it, right? And then you just have unusual behavior, right? Grief tends to alter us, just change us, right? And so that's the end of my list. I wanted to get to the end of my list before we ended our class. So next week, so today we talked about grief and Job's. Next week, we're going to talk about how to help those in grief. Because in the book of Job, Job's friends do a very poor job. So we're going to take a second to ask, okay, if we were Job's friends, what would be the right approach to someone in that kind of situation? All right, thank you very much. Thank you for letting me go a little bit over.